So that is And our next plenary speaker is Dr. Prateep Nayak for session 15. And Dr. Nayak is an associate professor in the School of the Environment, Enterprise, and Development at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Nayak's research focuses on the understanding of complex human-environment connections in coastal marine ecosystems, with particular attention to socio-ecological change, its drivers, their influence, and possible ways to deal with them. Dr. Nayak is currently implementing collaborative research projects that focus on small-scale fisheries systems in Southeast Asia and China. Today, Dr. Nayak will be presenting on vulnerable yet viable fisheries and aquaculture amidst global change processes. So welcome, Dr. Nayak.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm also thankful to the conveners of the session 15 who have invited me to give this keynote here in the plenary today. I'm so happy that Meryl's presentation sets a kind of a background to my presentation. So there might be some repetitions, but those are going to be very positive and reinforcing repetitions. As you can see, I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities, but I'm also going to talk about how do you move away from vulnerabilities in a small-scale fisheries context. Therefore, I would like to, in my 20 minutes time, explore what are some of the strengths that exist within these communities, which can be our basis to move forward and lead these communities into the domain of viability. How can we make them viable? So I was going to say a few things about the session 15, but you have already heard about it. This is titled as Fisheries and Aquaculture in the Face of Climate Change, Current Actions, Identified Solutions and Opportunities in Support of Sustainable Livelihoods and Food Security. There is a number of objectives there, but overall it looks at what are the approaches that can be talked about, and in terms of making this sector viable. So to start with, if you look at small-scale fisheries as a sector, it is actually large. There are many details that provides us the basis to talk about small-scale fisheries as a large rural sector, especially looking at Asia and Africa. It provides not only jobs, livelihoods, food security, and cultural identity, but it also hosts 90% of the 38 million fishers that are classified as small-scale fishers. It employs 90% of the world's captured fishers, fish workers, and half of them are women. That's a significant number. It contributes about half of global fish catches, and if you look at in terms of direct human consumption, it actually rises up to two-thirds of the total catches. Here is a figure which talks about 2014 capture fisheries and aquaculture production were at a high of more than 160 million tons, and out of that, capture fisheries was about 93 millions. If you look at the distribution between small-scale fisheries and large-scale fisheries, small-scale fisheries in the marine sector is actually larger than the large-scale fisheries. 33 million tons as compared to 31 million tons in the marine sector. But in inland, it is really a significant portion, which is sitting at 14 million tons, whereas the large-scale fisheries is only 1 million ton. So that signifies that this sector is really large as compared to the large-scale fishery itself. But we are facing a challenge that talks about how this large, small-scale fisheries sector is growing more and more vulnerable, not only because of climate change, but also because of a multiple, set of drivers that keeps constantly influencing this particular sector. And Morel has already talked about some of them. It includes expansion of large-scale industrial fisheries, growth of aquaculture in certain parts of the world, creation of protected areas, unsupportive policy frameworks, and reallocation of coastal resources to other uses. So how do we deal with these vulnerabilities? Given all these multi-level challenges is something that I'm going to talk about in my presentation. I would start with a key question, which is what strategies and approaches can we use to look at vulnerabilities, understand vulnerabilities, but at the same time also identify key strengths. Therefore, we can talk about viable fishing systems in these small-scale communities. So these three things are going to be highlight of my main presentation. I define vulnerability as multidimensional, complex, highly dynamic, and relative term, and I use three key measures to define vulnerability. One way to look at vulnerability is to look at vulnerability as the absence of well-being, and well-being is defined as a state of being with others, where human needs are met, where one can act meaningfully to pursue one's goals, and where one enjoys a satisfactory quality of life. As you can see, this is very qualitative. But it has three key ingredients, or three key dimensions, which are material, which is more tangible, and you can look at what are those material aspects of well-being in terms of income, in terms of the actual catch and the production. But it is also something that is influenced by relational and subjective aspects of well-being, at a more individual and community level. Vulnerability can also be understood as a lack of access to capitals, and as you can see, livelihood approach tells us that there are at least 5 different types of capitals: human, physical, natural, social, and financial capitals. And what happens in a situation of vulnerability is that it enables individuals to navigate their position when they feel vulnerable. So use these assets and capitals to overcome vulnerabilities. And then the third way of looking at vulnerability is to look at how a loss of resilience, which is the capacity to still function and move on in situations of change and in situations of dismay and threat. Resilience is all about then options and flexibility that can be maintained in a system to make it more viable. It is about the adaptive capacity, which is the no man's land between vulnerability and resilience, as you can see in the figure given by Engel, 2011. And some recent work also focuses on how there are different time scales through which you can address these vulnerabilities to move towards viability. Coping can be very short-term responses to vulnerabilities. Adaptation can take a longer period and more strategic interventions and responses. And transforming responses could be rather more long-term in terms of finding an alternate situation in terms of transforming the sector itself. I will take you to Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal, where we did a large survey of 150 villages of small-scale fishing communities, where we looked at 150 villages, which comprises of 400,000 people, and looked at a number of drivers that have been causing vulnerability in these particular communities. One of them is a hydrological intervention, as you can see on the three-dimensional map there. Is a hydrological intervention whereby a new seamouth was created between the Bay of Bengal and the coastal lagoon, which is known as Chilika. It caused a lot of distress ecologically. It started to have sand infestation. It started to have all the things that can flow into the lagoon from the sea. In the 1980s, a second drive started to kind of, attack this particular area, these 150 villages, which was, a growing number of aquaculture farms. And overall impact of aquaculture in that particular lagoon was that it displaced the small-scale fishers from their customary fishing areas. In terms of ecological vulnerability, there was a number of things, and I will highlight some of that. The lagoon, the coastal lagoon, was started to be infested by barnacles, and we know barnacles are sea creatures. Once they start to, thrive in a lagoon, which means the pH factor, the salinity level has increased, and therefore fishing becomes impossible. You just can't walk on barnacles to fish, and people started to see creatures, a stingray, jellyfish, and other kinds of sea creatures that are new to the lagoon, and they make the fishing habitat very, very unfriendly. The bottom right picture, you see two types of shrimps, and people started to see both the shrimps in the month of July, whereas they follow different seasonalities. And one comes in the month of April, the other one comes in the month of June, but here they were finding both together in the same season. Some fish habitats became crab habitats, so there was no fish, but only crabs. 11 fish species, which were very typical to that region, went extinct within a period of 10 years. So there was a lot of ecological crises that were seen following those interventions. But also on the social side, there was a number of effects that started to be seen. Of course, the fish catch went really, really low. People who used to catch hundreds of kilograms of fish, and that net can actually hold more than 100 kilograms of fish, started to catch what you see on the net there. So the fish production went down, livelihoods were affected, food security was in danger, and people started to kind of lose their identity because they started to migrate. 1/3 of the adult fishers had migrated by 2010. You can see a graph. By 2008, there were no villages out of those 150 total which were left without populations migrating out. So there was large-scale occupational displacement through migration that took place. Institutionally, fish cooperatives went out of business. So our survey shows that 122 out of the 150 became dormant because there was less and less fish. There was no business to do. But also the institutional fabric was eroded because these institutions were not only dealing with fish, but they were also dealing with many other socioeconomic and cultural aspects of those communities. So this institutional fabric was completely eroded at that point in time. We also found that women specifically were vulnerable because the size of the fish determined the power of the woman in that particular region. When it used to be larger fish, women would take control of the fish, they would process it, they would market it, they would deal with it, they would take cash out of it, they would preserve it for the household for the future. But with all these changes, one of the indicators of vulnerability was that women who used to deal with large fish started to deal with really small fingerlings. And there was a large-scale downgrade in the total amount of power that women held in that society with the size of the fish. However, there were also strengths that we were able to capture through our survey. People started to kind of look at alternatives in terms of building and strengthening local institutions, experimenting new ways of fishing technologies, but also taking fishing as a daily routine. And people often talk about how fishing in that particular region has become a kind of a daily movement, a protest, and they have to engage in the particular movement to be able to sustain their livelihoods and identity. So these are all kind of strengths that emerge, and of course there's a large number of lists. And putting that into a kind of initial framework, we looked at what are some of the key dimensions of vulnerability that are emerging from this particular survey. Of course, we looked at absence of well-being, lack of access to capitals, loss of resilience, areas of vulnerability, and in small-scale fishery in that region, resulting from those 3 areas of loss. Okay, there is a lot of details in terms of what are those vulnerabilities in each of those areas. I'm not going to go into details of that, but all of those things, a loss in all of those 3 areas, resulted in vulnerability. But also, there is growing indication that there are strengths in each of these 3 areas, which could be increase in well-being, better access to capitals, building resilience, that can really move the system, move the small-scale fishers towards being more viable. So there are, of course, vulnerabilities, but there are also strengths that can be used, and people are using in that particular region to move towards viability. So you can look at well-being, resilience, and capitals, and much more. So what are the key lessons we draw from those strengths and vulnerabilities to be able to move towards viable systems? So this is not a list that gives everything, but this is a list that kind of captures some of the key points from the story that I just told you. We need to look at multi-level drivers. And often, in a situation of crisis, you find that drivers don't act alone. Drivers act synergistically. Aquaculture as a driver might join hands with the hydrological intervention that I just talked about and policy changes to make a bigger impact. So we need to look at not only multi-level drivers, but also the synergistic effects of drivers and design our responses. We need to look at, of course, the levels of interventions, because often we find that the level of intervention, there's a mismatch in there. So where the intervention is being made and where it is being made is kind of shadowed by the gap in there. So interventions often doesn't work because it comes from a different scale altogether. So there is need to be attention to levels and scales of intervention in terms of moving towards viability. The third one is to look at the context, the vulnerability context, and Merrill has already kind of pointed to some of that. What is the specific context within which vulnerabilities are taking place, and who are becoming vulnerable? And if we understand that, and we need to understand that within a kind of an unit, we call it a social, ecological, human, environmental unit within which vulnerabilities take place. Therefore, that is another. 2 very interesting aspects, and I will just take 30 seconds or 40 seconds after this slide to talk about that, are the equity and social justice and power and politics considerations, which are kind of core to small-scale fisheries and, of course, large-scale fisheries also. And then the ultimate is, how do you bind all of that through a governance arrangement, which is building relationships, bringing transparency, making multi-level arrangements, and, doing institutions and a lot of things in terms of those. The story that I told you is also told in different ways. This is one of the ways that this story is told, where, there's an alternate narrative where, especially people who support aquaculture, people who support policy changes, say that everything is rosy and fine in that lagoon. So they report that there is 5-fold increase, 10-fold increase, 16-fold increase in different products, and there is a overall increase in the incomes of people. If we look at that, really, we need to look at who is defining these narratives, because the definition of vulnerability might just change depending on who is telling the story. So how change is framed by certain groups, as significant or not, is important, and because that leads us to the extent that framing is going to be used to ignore or facilitate change processes. We might be doing the wrong intervention if we have a wrong narrative around change. But at the same time, change can create new opportunities and upward social and economic mobility for some, but excludes others. How do you understand in the context of vulnerability? How do you move towards viability, given that there are people who are going to benefit from any kind of change that you might talk about? And on the social justice side, if we, during the survey, we found that, of course, there are kitchens. It's a village kitchen, which, if it looks like this, that means perhaps people are not cooking their food regularly. It doesn't look like this otherwise, okay? And you walk a kilometer or two up from there, there is floating restaurants, you can pay $25, to have a sumptuous meal, And this contrast, talks to the social injustices that kind of, impacts the situation. I just wonder, I'm running out of time, and I ran out of time actually, but I also wanted to highlight that there are different kind of responses that exist. One of them is the small-scale fisheries guideline, which tries to kind of address these vulnerabilities by empowering small-scale fishers. It talks about key provisions in terms of tenure rights, sustainable resource management, social development, employment and decent work, value chain, post-harvest and trade, and how to bring in gender equality and disaster risk and climate change. And all these are key components of that. And it tries to kind of make policy provisions or instructions to country governments to make policies and provisions in each of these areas so that this sector, which is facing so much of vulnerability, can be strengthened and pushed towards viability. I'm going to skip a few slides and then conclude. Just take 1 minute. So there is a lot of sources that exist, and I'll just fly through this quickly. Look at case study database of Equator Initiatives, which provides 378 cases that kind of outline best practices in terms of small-scale fishing communities. They have also nature-based solution database, which has more than 700 case studies, which talks about how do you make nature based interventions through these small communities around the world to make them viable. Community conservation livelihoods partnership or network has community stories that looks at how you can deal with these vulnerabilities by looking at livelihood and conservation relationships and also telling stories around communities in action. So it's a good source to look at how to deal with vulnerabilities, build on strengths, and move towards viability. Too Big to Ignore project, you can always check them on their website, has a ISSF, which is information system on small-scale fisheries, which has more than 3,000 case studies, which talks about how this sector is doing, because that's 90%, as I told in my first slide, and how to deal with their vulnerabilities and how can they move towards viability. So rich source of case studies that talks about a lot in terms of moving towards vulnerability. And then the last slide, really, I wanted to highlight, how to capture some of those narratives and some of those pictures is through a Voices of Poor approach, which comes from World Bank, and then the series of 3-volume Voices of the Poor books, where they talk about there are 2.5 billion poverty experts, and these experts are not someone who sits in an international organization or a national policy-making institution, but these are people who go through poverty through their everyday life. And this lays out a nice kind of approach to understand vulnerability, understand strength, and move towards viability. Thank you. I'm sorry for the extra time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nayak. So we have a time for a couple of questions. Please come to the microphone, please. Okay, so I have one question. So you mentioned about the relationship between the women's power and the fish size. Is that actually a very important effect for the women's powers? The size is so effective, so.
Yes, it might be easier to process, easier to sell, easier to, move, but then it doesn't bring the amount of economic benefit it used to bring in terms of large fish, And it is also very metaphorical in terms of the size, So who controls what in a small community, which is typically a male-dominated community otherwise, the size determines a lot. So yes, I would say it is a big indicator of the level of power that women hold in that particular society.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much again
Thank
for
you.
your
Thanks very
excellent talk. Thank you.